Everyone remembers the photographs, the celebrating crowds, the kissing, the flowers thrown at tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées. Liberation, joy, victory. Nobody remembers the bodies we stepped over to get there. I was born in Brooklyn, 1923. Joseph Castellano, Joe to everyone who knew me. Italian-American family, working class, loud Sunday dinners with too much food and too many relatives. My old man worked the docks, wanted me to do the same, make an honest living, stay out of trouble. Then December 7th, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor. Everything changed overnight. I enlisted in January 1942. 19 years old and stupid enough to think war was an adventure. The recruitment posters made it look glorious. Defeat tyranny, save the world, come home a hero. My ma cried when I left. My father shook my hand and told me to keep my head down. My kid brother Frankie looked at me like I was the luckiest guy in the world. Basic training at Fort Benning, infantry. They taught us to march, shoot, follow orders. Told us we were the best army in the world, that we'd roll over the Germans like they rolled over France. Made it sound easy. I shipped out to England in November 1943. Joined the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, Pennsylvania National Guard boys mostly, but they took us replacements from all over. Good men, tough men. We trained in the English countryside, preparing for something big. Nobody told us what, but we all knew. Invasion was coming. D-Day, June 6th, 1944. We weren't in the first wave. That honor went to other poor bastards. We landed on Omaha Beach 3 days later. The beach was still littered with wrecked landing craft and bodies half buried in the sand. That should have told me something. We pushed through the hedgerows of Normandy. Brutal fighting. Every field was a fortress. Every hedgerow hid German machine guns. We lost men daily. The French countryside was beautiful. Rolling hills, old stone farmhouses, orchards. We turned it into a graveyard. By August, we'd broken out. The German army was retreating. We were advancing fast now, racing across France. The brass said Paris was next, the city of light. 4 years under Nazi occupation, and we were going to set it free. They made it sound like a parade. Like liberation would be all champagne and grateful French girls and celebrations. They didn't mention the dying we'd have to do first. We reached the outskirts of Paris on August 24th, 1944. The French resistance had risen up inside the city, fighting the Germans in the streets, building barricades, risking everything. They needed help, needed us. General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division was supposed to liberate Paris, political reasons, French pride, all that. But they were getting held up by German positions south of the city. So elements of the 28th Division were ordered to support them, push through the German defenses, open the way to Paris. We moved out at dawn. My squad, 12 men in a half-track, was attached to a tank company. The plan was simple. Punch through the German lines at Frasnes, a town just south of Paris. Break their defense, let the French armor through. Simple. That word should have been a warning. The town looked quiet as we approached. Too quiet. The buildings were intact, streets empty. No civilians, no movement, just silence. "I don't like this," Sergeant Martinez said. He was our squad leader, veteran of North Africa and Sicily. If he didn't like something, we paid attention. We dismounted from the half-track and moved forward on foot. Standard infantry tactics. Use the buildings for cover. Stay spread out. Watch for snipers. The first shot came from a second-story window. Saw the muzzle flash before I heard the sound. Private Cooper went down. Just dropped. We hit the dirt, trying to find cover. Then all hell broke loose. Machine gun fire from multiple positions. The Germans had turned the town into a fortress. Every building was a strong point. Every window held a rifleman or machine gunner. They'd let us walk right into a killing zone. Martinez was yelling orders, but I could barely hear him over the gunfire. Return fire, move to cover, keep your head down. I made it to a doorway, pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small. Bullets were chipping away at the stone around me, dust and chips raining down. Cooper was lying in the street, not moving. We couldn't reach him, couldn't help him, just had to leave him there and keep fighting. The tanks came up, their main guns booming. They started putting high explosive shells into the buildings where the Germans were firing from. The explosions were deafening, whole walls collapsing, smoke and dust everywhere. We pushed forward building by building, kick in a door, throw in a grenade, storm in shooting, clear one room, move to the next. The Germans fought for every inch. Some surrendered, most didn't. I killed a German in a kitchen. He was young, maybe 18. Came around a corner and we were face to face, 3 feet apart. I was faster. Shot him twice in the chest. He fell backward into a table, knocking over a vase of flowers. The flowers were still fresh. Someone had put them there that morning before the fighting started. I moved on, couldn't stop, couldn't think about it. The fighting went on for hours. By mid-afternoon, we'd pushed through the town. The German defense was broken, but it had cost us. 6 men from my squad killed or wounded. Cooper, Jenkins, Rodriguez, Paulson, O'Brien, Williams. Half our strength gone in one morning. And we weren't even in Paris yet. This was just the approach. We regrouped on the far side of town. Martinez was checking on the survivors. His face was grim. This is what they're going to make us pay for Paris, someone said. Every damn town between here and the city. Martinez just shook his head, didn't have an answer. We mounted up and moved out. The French armor was pushing through now, racing for Paris. We followed behind, supporting, mopping up any German resistance they bypassed. The sounds of fighting echoed from the city ahead. Gunfire, explosions. The resistance was still fighting, still holding out, waiting for us. As the sun set, we could see Paris in the distance, the Eiffel Tower rising above the buildings, the city we'd been fighting toward for months, so close now. But between us and that city were more Germans, more fighting, more men who'd die before we could celebrate liberation. The photos would show the happy ending, the crowds and the joy. They wouldn't show friends, wouldn't show Cooper dying in the street or that German kid in the kitchen with his flowers. Nobody wants to remember the price, just the victory. We entered Paris proper on the morning of August 25th. The city was chaos, beautiful, ancient chaos. The resistance had been fighting for days. Barricades made of cobblestones and furniture blocked the streets, burnt out vehicles everywhere. The smell of smoke and cordite and death hung in the air. Buildings showed bullet scars and shell damage. This wasn't the pristine Paris from postcards. This was a city at war with itself. The Germans were still holding strong points throughout the city, the Luxembourg Gardens, the Senate building, various government offices. They'd fortified these positions and were fighting to the last. Hitler had ordered the city destroyed rather than surrendered. General von Koltitz, the German commander, hadn't followed that order completely, but he wasn't giving up without a fight either. We moved through the streets in column. French civilians appeared from buildings, cheering, crying, throwing flowers. It should have been joyous. It was, for them. For us, it was surreal. One moment we were fighting for our lives. Next moment, people were kissing us and offering wine. But the celebration was premature. Gunfire echoed from blocks away. German positions were still active. Men were still dying while others were celebrating. We got pinned down near the Place de la Concorde. German troops in the Hôtel de Crillon were firing down on the square. Sniper fire and machine guns. We took cover behind a fountain. the same fountain where aristocrats had been executed during the Revolution. History on top of history, and we were adding our own blood to it. Private Daniels took a round through the throat, right next to me, just arterial spray and this horrible gurgling sound. I tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much, too fast. He died staring up at the Parisian sky, in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower, while civilians 3 blocks away were celebrating liberation. We called in the tanks. They put rounds into the hotel until the Germans either retreated or died. Probably both. The beautiful facade of the hotel was destroyed. Centuries-old architecture reduced to rubble because of a war. Martinez was hit during the assault. Shrapnel from a grenade caught him in the leg. Not fatal, but he was done fighting. They evacuated him to an aid station. That left me in charge of what remained of the squad. 4 men, 4 out of 12. We pushed toward the German headquarters at the Hotel Meurice on the Rue de Rivoli. This was where von Koltitz had his command post. If we took that, the German resistance would collapse. That was the theory anyway. The fighting around the hotel was vicious. The Germans knew this was their last stand. They fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose, room to room, floor to floor, grenades and small arms and close quarters brutality. I shot a German officer on the 2nd floor. He was coming out of a room with his hands up, surrendering. But Private Morrison didn't see that, just saw the uniform and fired. The German fell. I saw papers scatter from his hands, documents, intelligence. He'd been trying to surrender and give us information. Morrison looked at me. Didn't see his hands, he said. But his eyes said different. Said he saw them and didn't care. That the time for mercy had passed somewhere back in Normandy. Maybe he was right. I don't know anymore. We secured the hotel by mid-afternoon. Von Koltitz surrendered formally, all very proper and military, handed over his pistol, shook hands with French officers, like it was a gentleman's sport and not the brutal slaughter it had been. Outside, the celebration was building. French resistance fighters were parading captured Germans through the streets. Some were being beaten, some worse. I saw things that made me sick. But who was I to judge? These people had lived under occupation for 4 years, had watched their country be raped and plundered, had seen friends and family deported, executed, disappeared. What right did I have to tell them how to feel? The sun was setting when we finally got a moment to rest. We'd been fighting for 24 hours straight. I sat on the steps of some grand building, didn't even know what it was, and tried to process what we'd done. We'd liberated Paris. Mission accomplished. The city was free. Soon Eisenhower and de Gaulle would parade down the Champs-Élysées and the photographers would capture it all for history. But I kept thinking about Cooper dying in Fressen, about Daniels bleeding out at the fountain, about that German officer falling with surrender documents in his hands, about all the men who died to reach this moment and wouldn't be in any of those photographs. Morrison sat down next to me, pulled out a cigarette and lit it with shaking hands. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? A French woman came up to us, elderly, dignified. She said something in French I didn't understand, then kissed both my cheeks. There were tears in her eyes. She was thanking us for freeing her city. I wanted to tell her the truth, that we hadn't freed anything. We'd just killed enough men to make the killing stop for a while. That liberation wasn't glorious or clean or righteous, that it was bought with blood and violence and the deaths of boys barely old enough to shave. But I just nodded and said, "You're welcome," in my broken French. She walked away smiling, happy, free. And I sat there covered in other men's blood, wondering when I'd ever feel free again. August 26th, the famous parade down the Champs-Élysées. General de Gaulle leading French forces through the liberated city. Thousands of Parisians lining the streets, cheering, weeping with joy. History being made. We weren't in the parade. The 28th Division was pushed to the outskirts, holding security positions. Made sense. This was France's moment. Their liberation, their glory. We'd just been the muscle that made it possible. Besides, we had work to do. The Germans were retreating east, but they weren't beaten. German snipers were still active in parts of the city. Collaborators were being hunted down, and there were concerns about a counterattack, though that never materialized. We spent the day clearing buildings, checking papers, trying to sort out who was resistance and who was collaborator. Ugly work. The French were settling scores. 4 years of occupation meant 4 years of grievances, betrayals, scores to settle. I saw women with their heads shaved being paraded through the streets. Horizontal collaborators, they called them. Women who'd slept with German soldiers. The crowds jeered and spat. Some of the women had children with them. Kids with German fathers who'd never asked to be born into this mess. Should we do something? Morrison asked, watching one particularly brutal scene. Not our fight, I said. Hated myself for saying it, but it was true. We were liberators, not occupiers. Not our place to judge how the French handled their own. The celebration in the city was continuous, wine flowing freely, people dancing in the streets, church bells ringing for the first time in 4 years. It should have been infectious, should have made us happy. But all I could think about was the men we'd left behind, the ones who didn't make it to see Paris free. Cooper and Daniels and Rodriguez and all the others. They'd fought and died for this moment, and they'd never know what their sacrifice achieved. We got pulled out of Paris on August 28th. New orders. The war was continuing east. Germans were retreating toward their border. We had to keep pressure on them, keep them running, finish this thing. No time to celebrate, no time to rest, just pack up and move out and keep fighting. The next few weeks were a blur. Town after town, village after village. The Germans fought, delaying actions, trying to slow us down. We pushed through, lost more men, learned more names to forget, made more widows and orphans back home. The euphoria of Paris faded quickly. We were back to the grinding reality of war, cold nights, bad food, constant exhaustion. The fear that never really went away just became background noise you learned to ignore. We crossed into Belgium in September. More liberation, more grateful civilians, more photographs for the papers back home, and more fighting. Always more fighting. I got a letter from my ma in October. She'd seen newsreels of the Paris liberation. Said she was so proud of me. That the whole neighborhood was talking about our Joe liberating Paris. She wanted to know what it was like. Asked if I'd gotten to see the Eiffel Tower, if the French girls were as pretty as they said. I wrote back a lie. Told her it was wonderful. That liberation was everything we'd hoped for. That the French were grateful and the city was beautiful, and yes, the girls were pretty. Didn't mention Cooper dying in the street or Daniels bleeding out at the fountain. Didn't mention the German officer shot while surrendering or the collaborators being beaten by mobs. Didn't mention that I barely saw the Eiffel Tower because we were too busy fighting to play tourist. She wanted a hero son. I gave her one. The truth would have broken her heart. By November, we were in the Hürtgen forest. If Normandy was hell, Hürtgen was something worse. Dense woods, German defenses, constant artillery. We lost men by the dozens. The 28th Division was chewed up and spit out, nearly destroyed. I got hit on November 8th. Artillery shell landed close, shrapnel in my leg and arm. Not fatal, but enough to get me evacuated, enough to get me out of that nightmare forest. They sent me to a hospital in England. I'd heal, they said, be back in action in a few months, just in time for the final push into Germany. I should have been grateful. I'd survived. Made it through Normandy, through Paris, through the beginning of Hürtgen. The odds said I should be dead 100 times over. But lying in that hospital bed, all I could think about were the men still fighting. Morrison and Martinez and the others. The ones who didn't get lucky. The ones who'd keep fighting until the war ended, or they died, whichever came first. Paris was free. We'd done that. Given them back their city, their lives, their future. But the cost. God, the cost. I was still in the hospital when the Battle of the Bulge started in December. Germany's last major offensive. They hit our lines in Belgium, pushed through, caused chaos. The 28th Division, what was left of it after Hürtgen, was right in the path. I listened to the radio reports and felt sick, felt guilty. My friends were fighting and dying while I was safe in a hospital bed. Survivor's guilt, the doctors called it. Said it was normal, said lots of combat veterans felt it. Knowing it was normal didn't make it hurt less. News came in pieces. The division had been surrounded, fought its way out. Casualties were heavy. I tried to find out about my squad, about Morrison and the others. No one could tell me anything. Just casualties were heavy over and over again. I healed slowly. The wounds weren't that bad. I should have been back on my feet faster. But something in me had broken that had nothing to do with shrapnel. Some part of my mind or soul that just didn't want to heal, didn't want to go back. The doctors noticed, started asking questions about how I was sleeping, if I was having nightmares, if I was anxious. I lied, told them I was fine, just needed more time to heal physically. Truth was, I was terrified. Terrified of going back to the front, terrified of dying, but more terrified of living, of surviving when so many others hadn't, of being the one who made it home when better men than me were in graves across France and Belgium. I started having panic attacks, heart racing, couldn't breathe, sweating. They'd come out of nowhere. I'd be lying in bed and suddenly I was back in friends, back in Paris, watching Daniels die, watching Cooper fall. The hospital walls would close in and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. February 1945. They cleared me for light duty. Not combat ready, but well enough to be useful. They assigned me to a supply depot in England. Logistics, keeping the war machine running from the rear. I should have been relieved. Safe job. No more combat. I'd done my part. No one could say I hadn't done my part. Instead, I felt like a coward. Like I'd abandoned my friends. Like I'd quit. I got a letter from Martinez in March. He'd recovered from his leg wound, gone back to the unit. The letter was short, matter of fact. Most of the squad was gone now. Morrison killed in the Bulge. 2 other guys I'd served with. Martinez was with a new squad, new faces, carrying on. He ended the letter with, "You got out at the right time, Joe. Smart move. Nothing but dying left for the rest of us." I read that letter 100 times, tried to understand if he meant it as praise or condemnation. Couldn't tell, maybe both. The war in Europe ended in May. VE Day, victory, celebrations everywhere. I was in London when the announcement came. Thousands of people in the streets, cheering, kissing, crying with joy. The war was over. We'd won. I stood in Trafalgar Square surrounded by celebrating crowds and felt nothing. Just this vast emptiness where emotions should be. Someone thrust a bottle of champagne into my hands. A girl, pretty, young, full of life, kissed my cheek and thanked me for her freedom, for victory, for ending the nightmare. I smiled and nodded and drank the champagne and felt like the biggest fraud in the world. Because I knew the truth, knew that victory wasn't clean or simple or glorious, knew it was built on mountains of corpses and rivers of blood and the broken minds of men who'd seen too much. I thought about Cooper dying in that French street, never knowing we'd win, about Daniels at the fountain, about that German kid with his flowers, About Morrison, who'd survived Paris only to die in Belgium. About all of them. We'd won. But what did that mean for the dead? Did they care about victory? Did it matter to them that Paris was free, that Hitler was dead, that Germany was defeated? They were still dead, still gone, still buried in foreign soil or blown to pieces so small there was nothing left to bury. And I was alive. Standing in London on VE Day with champagne in my hand and a pretty girl's kiss on my cheek, feeling like I'd stolen something that wasn't mine. Feeling like I'd betrayed everyone who didn't make it by having the audacity to survive. That's when I understood. The war hadn't ended. Not for me. Not for any of us who'd been there. The shooting had stopped, but the war would go on inside us forever. I threw up in an alley behind the celebrations, stood there in the darkness while the crowds cheered, and knew with absolute certainty that I'd never be free of this. Paris was liberated, Europe was liberated, the world was free, but I never would be. I came home to Brooklyn in August 1945. The neighborhood threw a party, welcome home banners, my ma crying, my old man shaking my hand, proud. Everyone wanted to hear stories about liberating Paris, about being a hero, about victory. I told them what they wanted to hear, edited versions, sanitized. The celebration and the grateful French and the beauty of Paris. Left out everything that mattered, everything that was true. My kid brother Frankie had enlisted near the end of the war. Didn't see combat. War ended before he shipped out. He looked at me with disappointment, like I'd robbed him of something glorious. Like I'd had an adventure he'd missed. I wanted to grab him, shake him, tell him he was the lucky one. That missing combat was the best thing that ever happened to him. That there was no glory, no adventure, just death and trauma and nightmares that never end. But I didn't. Just smiled and told him he'd have made a fine soldier. I tried to go back to normal life. Got a job at the docks like my old man. Dated a girl from the neighborhood. Nice Italian girl my ma approved of. We got engaged. Everyone said it was perfect. War hero comes home, marries his sweetheart, lives happily ever after. But I couldn't sleep. The nightmares came every night. Cooper Daniels, the German kid, Morrison, all of them. Sometimes I'd wake up screaming. Sometimes I'd wake up crying. Sometimes I'd wake up and not know where I was, thinking I was back in France with Germans shooting at me. The engagement ended after 6 months. She tried to understand, she really did. But how could she? How could anyone who wasn't there understand what it was like? She'd talk about the future, about children and a house and growing old together. And all I could think about was Cooper dying at 19, never getting any of those things. The panic attacks got worse. Crowds were impossible. Loud noises made me hit the ground. I couldn't go to fireworks on the 4th of July. Sounded too much like artillery. Couldn't watch war movies. Too many memories. I started drinking. Not socially, not for fun. To forget. To make the memories stop. To quiet the voices of dead men who haunted me. My ma worried. My old man told me to snap out of it, to be a man, to get over it. The war's over, he'd say. Time to move on. But that was the problem. The war wasn't over. Not for me. I heard about Martinez in 1952. He'd shot himself, left a wife and 2 kids. The newspapers called it a tragedy, said he'd been a decorated veteran, said it was a loss. They didn't understand. It wasn't a loss. It was just the war finally catching up to him, taking what it was owed. I went to Paris once in 1978, 34 years after liberation. Thought maybe it would help. Thought maybe seeing the city at peace would give me some kind of closure. It was beautiful, rebuilt, thriving. The Champs-Élysées was full of tourists and cafes and life. The bullet holes were patched, the damage repaired. You couldn't tell there'd been a war there at all. I walked to where we'd fought at the Place de la Concorde, stood where Daniels died. There was nothing. No marker, no memorial, just tourists taking photos of the fountain and the Eiffel Tower in the distance. I tried to find the building where that German officer had surrendered and been shot. Couldn't remember which one it was. They all looked the same now, clean, peaceful, empty. The city had moved on, healed, forgot. And I was standing there alone with ghosts no one else could see. An old Frenchman noticed me standing there, came over, asked if I was all right in broken English. I told him I'd been here during the liberation. His eyes lit up, started thanking me, shaking my hand vigorously, called me a hero, said I'd saved his city. I wanted to tell him the truth, that we didn't save anything. We just killed enough people to stop the killing. That liberation wasn't beautiful, that it cost more than anyone should have to pay. But I just accepted his thanks and moved on. I'm 98 years old now, last survivor of my squad. Cooper, Daniels, Rodriguez, Martinez, Morrison, all gone. Some died in the war. Some died by their own hands after. Some lived longer, but carried the scars until their last breath. The history books remember the liberation of Paris as a great moment. The photographs show the joy and celebration. The documentaries talk about Allied victory and German defeat. Students learn about it as a turning point in the war. They're not wrong. It was all those things. But it was also horror and death and trauma. It was young men killing and dying in beautiful streets. It was blood on ancient cobblestones and screams echoing off buildings that had stood for centuries. Every August 25th, they commemorate the liberation in Paris. Ceremonies, speeches, remembrance. Sometimes they interview veterans, fewer and fewer each year. They ask what it was like, what we felt, what it meant. I tell them what they want to hear, about liberation and freedom and victory, about grateful French civilians and the joy of ending occupation. I don't tell them about the nightmares that still wake me at 3 a.m, about how I can't look at photographs from that day without seeing the faces of dead friends, about how I flinch at loud noises at 98 years old, about how I've spent 78 years trying to outrun memories that never fade. They remember the liberation, the moment of victory, the photographs of celebration. I remember the price, the cost in lives and souls and sanity. The young men who gave everything for that moment and never got to see what they'd bought. Everyone remembers the photographs. The celebrating crowds, the kissing, the flowers thrown at tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées. Liberation, joy, victory. Nobody remembers the bodies we stepped over to get there. Nobody wants to, but I do. I remember every one, Cooper and Daniels and that German kid and all the others. I carry them still, carried them through a lifetime that they never got to live. We liberated Paris. That's what the history books say. That's what people celebrate. But Paris was never the prisoner. We were, and we still are, all of us who fought there. All of us who survived. We're still trapped in August 1944, still fighting in those streets, still watching our friends die, still trying to understand why we lived when they didn't. The city is free, has been for 80 years, but we never will be. None of us ever came home.